The axe came down in a clean arc, its blade biting deep into the spruce log. A sharp crack split the morning silence, followed by the hiss of sap and the faint scent of resin drifting in the cold air. He worked without hurry, stacking the halves neatly beside the cabin wall, where frost clung like silver moss. The sun had yet to clear the peaks, but the sky was already whitening, hinting at the promise or the threat of another winter day. His breath showed in the air. He wiped the handle with a gloved hand, fingers stiff from hours of work. Out here, time was measured in the depth of the woodpile and the weight of snow on the roof. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with a beard grown thick not from fashion, but from necessity, the kind of man whose silence felt heavier than words. No one in town knew much about him anymore. He came down only once or twice a season for salt, flour, maybe a fresh grind on his tools. Folks knew him as a feller in the high timber, and left it at that. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, its warmth barely reaching the corners where shadows clung. On the table sat a tin plate, empty but for a strip of venison jerky, and beside it, a Bible with a photograph tucked between its pages. The picture was faded, faces blurred by time, but it looked at it enough that he no longer needed to see the details to remember them. He closed the book without opening it, as if the act of not looking kept the ache in his chest from growing sharper. By midday, the light thinned and clouds rolled in from the north, dragging a darker sky behind them. He took his rifle and set off into the timber, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent half a life stalking game. The snow was still shallow here, dusting the ground in white powder that crunched beneath his boots. Halfway down the ridge, he stopped. Out across the valley, where the trees broke into meadow, a thin thread of smoke rose into the air. Not the wide, steady plume of a homestead chimney, but a wavering line, small, uncertain, and out of place. His eyes narrowed. No one else was supposed to be this far into the back country. He stood still, listening. Only the wind moved, rattling dry pine needles overhead. Then, faint as a whisper, something reached him, high-pitched, quavering. It might have been the wind playing tricks, but it carried the timbre of human sound. A cry. The hair on his neck lifted. Strangers, this deep in, could mean trouble. Still, he turned toward the sound. It took him an hour to find them. The trail led him to the edge of a shallow gully where a broken wagon leaned at an awkward angle, one wheel shattered, the other mired in frozen mud. A horse lay on its side nearby, its ribs stark under its hide, steam no longer rising from its body. Beside the wagon stood a woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Her cheeks were raw from wind, her hair tangled in the cold breeze. She had 3 children close to her, 2 boys and a little girl, all in mismatched coats and scarves. The oldest boy looked no more than 12. The youngest clung to his mother's skirt, his small face pale and hollow-eyed. She turned at the sound of his boots on the crusted snow. Her eyes were wary, hand clutching the boy's shoulder as though ready to pull him behind her. "We're just resting," she said, though the lie was plain in her voice. "We'll move on soon." He didn't answer right away, taking the cracked wagon tongue, the ragged state of their boots, the bluish tinge on the youngest fingers. The cold was sinking fast now. Another night out here would be a death sentence. "Where from?" His voice was low, rough from disuse. "North. Came through Pine Hollow 3 days back. My husband," she swallowed, eyes darting to the children. "There were men on the trail. They took him from us." He shifted his weight, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "Bandits. Out here, it didn't take much imagination to picture the rest." "We don't want trouble," she said. He looked past her at the children. Their lips were chapped, their cheeks raw, but it was the way they kept watching him, silent, wide-eyed, that gnawed at him. In their eyes he saw something he recognized, the bone-deep understanding that the world could take everything from you and not blink. "Cabin's not far," he said finally. "Follow me." The woman hesitated, glancing at the broken wagon, as if clinging to the last of her old life. Then she gathered the children, murmured something to them, and stepped away from the wreck. He led them through the timber, breaking trail in the knee-deep drifts where the wind had drifted snow into white waves. The oldest boy tried to keep pace, carrying his sister when she stumbled, while the woman helped the youngest along. The only sound was the crunch of snow and the occasional cough from one of the children. The cabin came into view just as the light failed, its small windows glowing faintly against the dark. Smoke curled from the chimney into the starless sky. Inside, the air was warmer, though still cool enough that their breath lingered in faint clouds. He stoked the fire, added another log, and filled a pot with water from the barrel. The woman guided the children toward the hearth, helping them peel away wet mittens and scarves. The youngest fingers were red and swollen, but the color was coming back. He pulled down dried meat from a hook and set it to simmer with potatoes and wild onions. The smell began to fill the room. No one spoke much. The children watched him with quiet fascination, while the woman kept her eyes on the flames as though afraid to meet his gaze. When the food was ready, he ladled it into tin bowls. They ate with the slow hunger of people too tired to rush. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Afterward, the children drifted toward sleep, curled on blankets near the fire. The woman pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'm grateful," she said softly. He nodded once, busying himself with cleaning the pot. Gratitude was fine, but it didn't change the fact that strangers in these woods meant questions, and questions often led to trouble. Still, as he watched the children breathe in slow, even rhythms, he felt something shift. Something he hadn't felt in years, maybe not since before the photograph in the Bible had been taken. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Outside, snow began to fall, erasing tracks, covering the broken world in silence. By morning the storm had deepened. Snow pressed against the cabin walls like a slow, patient tide. The wind moaned in the stovepipe, sending smoke curling sideways before it vanished into the gray sky. He stepped outside to check the drift line, the door pulling against his shoulder as if the weather itself meant to keep him in. The trees groaned under their burden, releasing sudden thumps of snow when branches gave way. Inside, the woman was tending to the youngest boy's hands, rubbing them with bare grease to ease the stiffness. The girl sat beside her, wrapping strips of old flannel into makeshift mittens. The oldest boy, tall for his age but still lean as a sapling, hovered near the door, studying the woodsman with a cautious sort of interest, as if trying to learn the shape of him. The man busied himself with the morning fire, feeding it with kindling before laying on larger logs. He offered no speech, but the rhythm of his work seemed to set the pace of the room. The woman, sensing his reticence, kept her own words measured, speaking mostly to the children in low tones. Later, when the light sharpened against the windows, he set the eldest boy to spling a stack of pine rounds near the door. The lad's first swings were clumsy, the axe biting at odd angles. The woodsman stepped forward, taking the handle in his own hands, showing the arc, the drop, the way to let the weight of the head do most of the work. The boy nodded, tried again, and when the log split clean, a rare smile flashed across his face. Meals became a silent exchange of labor. She cooked rabbit stew, bannock fried in lard, while he kept the fire, repaired the roofline where ice had sagged the beams, and checked the snares down by the creek. The girl began sweeping the floor each morning, without being asked. The youngest trailed after him when he moved about the yard, small boots punching neat holes in the snow. The days began to knit themselves into a rhythm, yet the edges of that peace were frayed by the unspoken. In the evenings, when the firelight turned the log walls gold, he would catch her gaze, steady, searching, as though she was measuring him, deciding what sort of man he truly was. He knew she was holding something back, just as he was. Out here, truth was currency, and neither of them was ready to spend more than they had to. It was on the fifth morning that he found the tracks. They cut across a high ridge above the creek. Fresh horse prints, wide apart, the kind made by animals carrying men with rifles. He crouched beside them, brushing away a thin skim of snow to see the crisp edges beneath. More than one set. He followed for 100 yards until they bent southward, away from his line, but the sight of them coiled in his mind like a warning snake. When he returned, he said nothing about it. But that evening, he cleaned his rifle at the table, the smell of oil mixing with the tang of cooking onions. The boy watched closely, eyes darting to each movement of the rod and patch. The man spoke at last. "You ever handle one of these?" The boy shook his head. He opened the chamber, showed him the bolt, the way the cartridges fed in. No talk of using it. Not yet, just the mechanics, the care of it. The boy's hands were steady on the stock, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of nerves. The woman noticed. Why teach him that? She asked, her tone even but not without edge. Because the world doesn't care if he knows or not, he said. It'll come for him just the same. She held his gaze for a long moment, then went back to her cooking. 2 nights later, the wind died, leaving the woods in a brittle, echoing silence. That kind of quiet carried sound a long way, and it was just before dawn when he heard it. A distant creak, faint but distinct, like saddle leather shifting under weight. He sat up on his cot, listening until the noise faded. No hoofbeats, not yet, but enough to put a shadow over the morning. The next day, he doubled the snare lines, kept the rifle closer to hand. When the girl came to show him the rag doll she'd made from scraps of cloth, he smiled in spite of himself. She looked at him with open trust, and the thought slid into his mind unbidden. He could not let anything happen to these children. Snow fell again that night, light and powdery, covering all but the deepest tracks. By the fire, the woman told a story from her childhood about chasing fireflies on summer nights, the children leaning against her as she spoke. He sat in the corner, carving a piece of pine into the rough shape of a horse, the shavings curling at his feet. Her voice, low and steady, filled the cabin like the warmth of a stove. When the story ended, there was a hush in which even the crack of the fire seemed muted. The boy broke it by asking the man if he'd ever had children of his own. The question hung there, the flames catching in his eyes as he considered the right response. He only said, "I did," and returned to his carving. The woman's gaze flickered toward him, a trace of something unreadable passing over her face. She did not press him. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft as breath, but somewhere beyond the edge of the timber he imagined men moving through it, leaving no sound, only the faintest trace of threat. That thought followed him to sleep and into his dreams, where the wind in the trees sometimes carried the echo of hooves. When morning came, the world outside was blinding white, the horizon swallowed in haze. The youngest tugged at his coat, wanted to walk to the creek. He almost said no. It was too cold, too dangerous. But then he saw the boy's pleading eyes and relented. Together they trudged through the snow, the child's laughter bright and startling against the stillness. By the time they returned, the woman had baked fresh bread in the Dutch oven, the smell rich and warm in the small cabin. She looked at him over the children's heads as they tore into it, her expression softer now, though still holding that measuring quality. He wondered how long before she would trust him completely, or if she ever would. That evening, after the children were asleep, she spoke quietly. "If those men find us, they won't leave us breathing." He met her eyes across the firelight. "Then they won't find us." She searched his face, perhaps looking for the certainty she wanted to hear. He gave her no more than that, but the truth was already settled in him. Whatever danger was coming, it would have to go through him first. Outside in the dark, snowflakes drifted like ash from an unseen fire, falling over the roof, the yard, and the old tracks that still led back into the trees. Somewhere beyond sight, the wind carried the faint smell of smoke, not their own. The thaw never came. Each dawn arrived heavy with frost, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. The creek ran under a lid of ice so thick he had to strike it twice with the back of the axe before water showed in the cracks. Life pressed into small patterns, cut wood, checked snares, mend gear, but every task now carried a new undercurrent. He could feel the horizon watching him. The boy had grown steadier with the rifle. At first, he'd flinched at the dry snap of the trigger, but now he held his aim longer, his breathing slowing just before the pull. They practiced in the gully behind the cabin where the snow caught the brass like gold coins scattered in white sand. The woodsman said little, only adjusting the boy's grip now and then, but inside he felt the weight of what he was doing. Teaching a child to handle a gun meant accepting that he might one day have to use it. The woman's guard had shifted. She still measured her words, but she'd begun asking him questions in the evenings. Where he lived before, how long he'd been in the mountains, if he'd ever thought about leaving. He gave her pieces, never the whole. Too many truths lived in the past, and some weren't meant for the telling. One afternoon, while he was setting a new snare line, movement caught his eye on the ridge. A trio of dark figures on horseback, their outline small but unmistakable against the pale sky. He dropped into a crouch, watching. They were scanning the valley below, pausing at intervals, one of them pointing toward the lower creek bend, the path that led almost directly to his clearing. He didn't move until they rode on, vanishing into the timber. When he stood, his knees popped in the cold, but the sound was drowned by the slow rush of blood in his ears. That night, he kept the rifle beside his cot. Sleep came shallow, broken by the creak of ice shifting on the roof and the imagined crunch of boots outside. Once, in the dark, he thought he heard the faint metallic clink of spurs far off in the trees. In the morning, he told her. She didn't flinch. Perhaps she'd been expecting it. "They'll come," she said simply. "If not tomorrow, then the day after." Her voice had the flat certainty of someone who'd lived with fear long enough to stop doubting its arrival. He began preparing without ceremony. Moved supplies from the shed into the cabin. Checked the shutters, nailed them tighter. Showed the boy where the extra ammunition was kept. Even the youngest was given a task, to keep the water pot full and the fire fed if things went bad. The girl, quiet and quick were her hands, was set to rolling cloth strips that could be used for bandages. In the still hours after these preparations, he found himself watching them differently. The boy's jaw was beginning to set like a man's, though there was still a child's fragility in the way his eyes darted to his mother. The girl clung to the woman's skirt less now, but she kept close to her brother, shadowing his movements. The youngest had taken to sitting on the floor near the woodsman's boots, his small hands playing with bits of twine or with shavings, content just to be near. 2 days passed without sight of the riders. Snow fell, then lifted, leaving the land pale and raw under the winter sun. The quiet almost convinced him they might have turned elsewhere, but on the third afternoon, while returning from checking the traps, he found something that dissolved the thought completely. A single horseshoe print in the snow, sharp-edged, the frost around it still damp, and beside it, the faint arc of boot leather pressed into the crust. He didn't follow it. Instead, he backed away, slow and deliberate, eyes sweeping the tree line. The sensation of being observed prickled along his spine. He imagined a pair of eyes watching from behind a spruce trunk, unseen but patient. That night, the woman told him more. She spoke of the men who'd taken her husband. 3 of them, maybe 4, wearing coats the color of mud and dust, their hats pulled low. She remembered one with a scar that cut across his mouth, so deep it seemed to pull his lip into a half-smile even when he wasn't speaking. Another had a cough, harsh and wet, that he couldn't hide even when he tried. He asked how they'd found her before. "We were on the main trail," she said. "They just came out of the trees, like they'd been waiting for us." When she fell silent, the fire popped, sending sparks against the iron stove door. The boy was watching again from his spot by the hearth, his eyes tracking every word as though trying to store them away. The next morning, frost covered the windows so thick he had to scrape them with the back of his knife to see outside. The sky was clear, brittle as glass, the kind of day sound carries for miles. He decided they needed more water. The creek was only a short walk, but the open ground worried him. He took the boy, telling the others to stay inside. They filled the buckets fast, but on the return he saw it again, movement between the trees. A dark blur slipping behind a stand of aspen, there and gone. He stopped cold, raising his hand for the boy to do the same. The boy followed his gaze but said nothing, his grip tightening on the bucket handle. They walked the rest of the way without looking back. That evening, the air inside the cabin was thick with unspoken things. Even the youngest seemed to sense it, staying close to the hearth. She busied herself with sewing a tear in the boy's coat, her hands moving in quick, small motions. When night came, he sat by the window, watching the black outline of the trees. The cold was a living thing pressing against the glass, but he stayed there, rifle across his knees, eyes straining for any sign of movement. It was past midnight when he saw it. A faint glint, like moonlight on metal, far out near the ridge. It disappeared, then returned, shifting as though carried by someone moving slowly through the dark. He didn't wake the others. Not yet, but his hands tightened around the rifle. the decision already forming. If they came closer, they would not find him unready. And somewhere deep inside, under the watchfulness and fear, a thought took root and settled. These people were his now. The snow fell soft through the night, covering the world in white silence, but it could not hide the fact that something was moving toward them. The morning came sharp and brittle, the kind of cold that made the air feel like splintered glass in the lungs. He'd been awake for hours, sitting by the window as the dark thinned into gray. Out beyond the yard, 3 riders waited at the edge of the timber, their breath showing in pale clouds. One raised a hand in greeting, though the gesture carried no warmth. The woman was already up, standing behind him with the children gathered close. Her eyes went to the riders, then to him. It's them. He didn't ask how she knew. He stepped outside, the snow crunching under his boots in sharp, deliberate rhythms. The rifle rested easy in his grip, but his eyes stayed on the man at the front, a tall shape wrapped in a mud-colored coat, a scar pulling his mouth into a crooked sneer. The other 2 sat slightly behind, their faces hidden in the low light. The scar man called out, his voice carrying clean across the cold. "We've come for what's ours." "She's not yours," the woodsman answered. The man laughed, though the sound held no mirth. "You think you can keep her? We'll take the woman, the brats, and whatever else you've got in that shack. You walk away, maybe we leave you breathing." The woodsman didn't move. "Ride on." The lead rider's smile widened. Wrong answer. The gunshot came sudden and sharp, sending snow into the air a few feet from his boots. He lifted the rifle and fired before the smoke cleared. One of the rear riders jerked sideways, tumbled into the snow with a muffled cry. The other 2 kicked their mounts forward, spreading out. He turned and ran for the cabin as the air filled with the whip and crack of gunfire. Bullets punched into the logs, sending splinters across the room. The boy was already at the table, hands steady on the cartridges. The woman pulled the 2 youngest under the heavy table, shielding them with her body. He worked the bolt, fired through the gap between the shutters. One rider swerved wide, circling toward the back of the cabin. The other came straight on, firing from the saddle, the shots chewing up the doorframe. The boy reloaded with quick, sure movements, handing the rifle back without hesitation. Outside, a horse screamed and bolted as another shot rang out. The woodsman ducked, glass shattering beside him. Pain burned through his left shoulder, hot, immediate, but not enough to stop him. He shouted for the boy to stay low, then slipped out the back. Snow swallowed his boots, the cold burning the wound raw. He kept to the trees, moving fast. The rider who'd swung wide was pushing through the drifts, scanning for the cabin door. The woodsman raised a rifle and fired. The man dropped into the snow, his horse veering off. A sound behind him, a branch snapping. He turned just as the scar man came out of the pines, a revolver in his hand. They were only a few yards apart. The man's mouth twisted in that permanent half-smile. Should have walked away. The revolver came up. The woodsman lunged forward, grabbing the barrel, the shot going wild into the trees. They slammed together, boots sliding in the snow. The revolver fell, lost in the white. Now it was fists, elbows, the raw effort of men trying to put each other down for good. The scarred man drove a knee into his side, but he held on, forcing them both into the drifts. They rolled, snow clinging to coats and beards, until the woodsman's hand closed around the knife at his belt. The man's eyes widened a fraction before the blade found its mark. The fight went still. He staggered up, chest heaving. The snow around him churned and stained. His shoulder throbbed with every breath, but the cabin was in sight now, smoke rising in a steady column. When he stepped inside, the woman was kneeling by the boy, checking him for injury. Her eyes lifted to his, taking in the blood on his coat. "You're hurt." "Not bad." He set the rifle down, letting the weight of it fall away. The youngest scrambled out from under the table and ran to him, small arms wrapping tight around his leg. The girl followed, pressing her face into his coat. The boy stayed by the table, his hands still resting on the cartridges, but his eyes shone with something like pride. He lowered himself to the chair, feeling the exhaustion set in. The woman crossed the room, tore strips from a clean sheet, and began binding his shoulder. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable, but she didn't look away from him. "They won't be back," he said quietly. She tied off the bandage, sat back, and let out a long breath. The fire cracked, filling the silence. The children stayed close, one on each side, as if afraid he might vanish if they let go. For the first time in years, he felt the weight in his chest ease, not gone, but change, reshaped into something he could carry. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and unhurried, covering the bodies and the broken tracks. Smoke rose from the chimney into the pale sky, the only sign of life for miles. He looked at the woman, then at the children, and knew without saying it that they were his now, as much as he was theirs.